Thank you very much, Ingo. I don't know if you can see me, or certainly you can see the presentation, I hope.
Yeah.
I think this is already the second time that I take part in one of your online events. I'm very happy to be here and give you the view from Brussels about how are we going to manage this very ambitious goal that we have set ourselves in Europe to become carbon neutral by 2050, as you know. You see, the title of my speech here is towards a CO2-free European energy sector, and I agreed with that title. But looking at it now, in a way, maybe it would have been better to say a carbon neutral European energy sector, because CO2-free it will never be. There will always be a few remaining greenhouse gas emission left, because it's difficult to imagine that we will be able to really do away with every single kilogram of CO2 emitted. But those that remain will have to be offset by some other technologies, basically what we call sort of negative emission technologies. So anyway, but I think you get the idea. I'm quite happy to talk you through the presentation this morning. Of course, I will also talk about the current situation and what we went through last year, which was a very very difficult year for energy in Europe, a difficult year also for the Commission. But at the end of the day, we managed quite well to deal with these new challenges that came out of the war in Ukraine and our very difficult relations with Russia as one of the previously main suppliers of energy to Europe. So I'll also talk a bit about that. So if you're all ready, let's kick off with the presentation. I think you will manage it from your end. So if we can see the first slide, which should show us the European Green Deal. And I will not talk very long about this, because I think many of you will be quite familiar with it. This is like the flagship of this current European Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen. She launched this very early into the mandate, and this is really the guiding, shall we say, vision for European developments, not just about this headline target of climate neutrality, which is of course very, very important, but also it should be seen as more an economic growth strategy, because it's quite clear that we need to manage this transition that we need of the energy sector and many other sectors as well, in a way which leaves Europe to continue to be prosperous in economic terms, and to have a just transition where, in a way, everybody in Europe, every citizen, every country as well, can see that this is really the right way to go, and that this makes sense and is very beneficial to each and every one. So it covers a lot of things. Transport sector, of course, is very important. Also the agricultural sector, this so-called farm to fork principles. Biodiversity and sort of the circular economy is also a very key element. So the European Green Deal was put forward, and all member states basically said that this was a very good vision for Europe. And as a result of that, we put forward then the Fit for 55 package, after we had done a thorough analysis of what was really required. And the next slide actually shows some of the key findings of this analysis. It was called the European Climate Target Plan, and it basically looked at how can we realistically achieve this target of reducing all emissions in Europe to zero in the next, shall we say, 30 years. And this is what you see on this picture here. So you see, first of all, the blue line is GDP. So you see continued economic growth at more or less the same pace as we have experienced since 1990. And then you see the different sectors and their emissions and how they have to reduce over the period to 2050. And I think really the very simple message here is that all sectors have to contribute towards this target. It's not possible really to imagine that there will be some sectors that can continue business as usual. Everybody will have to make efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think that's the first key message. The second key message is that already in the short term, by 2030, and that I think is now, it's fair to say that this is really the short term, already by 2030, we need to reduce our emissions by 55%. You will see that there are 45% emissions left. So that's the little dot and the dotted lines. And that was, I think, a very important finding, because at the time we were still under the commitments of the Paris Agreement, which talked about a 40% reduction, not a 55% reduction, but a 40% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This was what the EU had committed to under the Paris Agreement. And from this analysis, it was quite clear that a realistic trajectory, as we call it, so the line from now to 2050, would take us through a point of on this emission curve, which was significantly lower. And for that reason, we needed then to see whether this was something that member states and the European Parliament, the so-called co-legislators here in Brussels, would agree with. And basically they said, yes, this sounds like the right thing. Commission, can you please come forward with the instruments that are required to achieve this? And this is then what came out with the so-called Fit for 55 package that I also mentioned, and that's on the next slide. And that was in, I think, 2020 that came out. It was really a very comprehensive package, because all of these little boxes here represent a separate initiative, almost all of them in the shape of new legislation that would have to be adopted through the EU decision-making process. But the really important thing here is that all of these things were hanging together. There are very, very many links between these different initiatives. And the impact assessment we did to put forward all these proposals was really based on a common modeling, whereby we were able to show that if we do all of these things, there is really a very good chance that we can actually meet this ambition of reducing emissions by 55% already in 2030, and be on the right trajectory also towards 2050. You will see to the right here, those that, or at least on my screen, are sort of, I don't know what color they are, sort of light red, I suppose. The Renewable Energy Directive, the energy performance of buildings, energy efficiency, all of these are legislation that we here in DG Energy are responsible for. You have at the bottom, you have some important transport initiatives, looking at aviation and maritime sector in particular, but also the so-called AFIR, the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Regulation, basically saying we are going to have a lot of electric cars. We need to have the infrastructure in place for that. We also need other types of alternative fuels infrastructure in place. And then to the left, you see some of the more general climate type regulations. Of course, the emission trading scheme, the effort sharing regulation, but also things like LULUCF, land use change, and forest regulation, All of these are managed by our colleagues in DG Klima, and then there are a couple of other things like energy taxation and also the carbon border adjustment mechanism, recognizing that we need to make sure that the EU is not doing this in sort of splendid isolation, but that the rest of the world will follow. And basically this CBAM, as it's called, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is meant to be a strong incentive for third countries to do similar things that we're doing. And if they're not doing it, then certain products would actually be taxed when they reach the border of the EU to, so we say, compensate for the fact that, for example, there have been no payment for the CO2 that has been emitted during the production of these products. This is for cement, steel, fertilizer, also electricity, and that will now enter into force. It has been agreed. And I'll give you a little bit of an update on where we are on these different initiatives. Overall, we are on the right track, and there are still a few missing pieces where final adoption has not yet taken place, but essentially we're making really good progress towards having this huge legislative package adopted at EU level. Then many of these things are, of course, directives. And you know, directives have to be what we call transposed, which is essentially turned into national legislation. Normally, member states have a certain time for that, so that doesn't mean that even though it's adopted at EU level, it has not all kicked in. And of course, this is problematic because we are looking here at 2030, and in energy terms and in terms of securing the investments that are necessary to meet these targets, there is really no time to lose. So the sooner this can happen, the better. And therefore, we from the Commission have been pressing very hard for all of these things to be moving forward as fast as possible. If we look at the next slide, then of course, while we had all this beautifully planned, something happened in the world that we had not expected. Essentially, two things happened. First of all, at the end of 2021, we saw unexpected price increases on energy, especially gas. The analysis that we made was that this was due to global imbalances in the fossil fuel markets, especially for natural gas, and therefore prices shot up. That was essentially to do with the COVID crisis being over, or at least the worst part of it being over. And therefore energy demand was picking up, and during COVID there had been less investment in upstream energy, so there was this imbalance, and therefore prices really started to move up in a rather unprecedented way. And then of course on top of that, and adding to the effects of that, we saw the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and the fact that Russia used energy as part of its, so we say, pressure on the EU, and began to shut off gas deliveries to certain European countries. And that led the European Union and first of all, the Commission, of course, to develop a strategy for this. This is called Repower EU. Essentially, the objective of that is in a relatively short period to phase out completely imports of Russian fossil fuels through three key types of measures. First of all, we need to diversify energy sources, so we need to find other places where we can get our energy. We need to accelerate the clean energy transition, because that involves a lot of renewables, which are mostly homegrown, not completely, but a lot of this is energy, shall we say, developed and produced in Europe without need for imports. And then we need to become more efficient, so we need to save energy. And all of these elements where we then looked at first, of course, many of these things are already covered in the Fit for 55. We had, for example, the Renewable Energy Directive with higher ambitions for the share of renewables, but we also had different legislative initiatives on energy efficiency, for example, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, a very important piece of legislation, and the Energy Efficiency Directive. So as a result of Repower, the Commission then tried to further increase the level of ambition for these two pieces of legislation. And at the same time, we started to look at how can we help diversify energy sources. Of course, we do not, or at least at the time, we still do not actually do the contracts for energy with third countries, but we have tried to facilitate that, for example, through joint purchasing of especially gas from third countries, of course not Russia, but other third countries, and that's actually working quite well. The results of all that we have also seen very quickly. If we look at energy imports from Russia, they have really reduced. If we look at gas, which is the particularly sensitive and critical one, at the beginning of the crisis, they were something like 45% of all gas in the EU came from Russia. Today, it's around 15%, so we have reduced it, and it's now 1/3 of what it was. So that's already a major step in the right direction. We would like, in the coming years, really to completely eliminate imports from Russia. So there's still some way to go, because of course the remaining 15% are those where it's a little bit harder, where maybe the importers are not well connected, for example, to LNG terminals and things like that. On the energy savings front, we adopted legislation, and I have a slide actually showing all the different elements. I don't know if is that the next one? Maybe can we just have a quick look at that? Yes, that is the next one. So there you see from 24 February, which was in last year when Russia invaded Ukraine, we have come forward with a lot of initiatives, and a lot of these have been adopted. And the one I was just about to mention was the one from March. I think it's from the one from March, or maybe the one from May. But anyway, in the spring of last year, let's put it like that, to be certain, we managed to agree that everybody would make an effort to reduce gas demand by 15%, and that has actually been achieved. In fact, the EU as a whole is above 15%. I think it's something like 18%, and some countries are actually way above it, and others haven't quite reached it yet. But that was very important. We also adopted legislation that meant that member states had an obligation to fill up their gas storages. That was also important in terms of stabilizing prices. And there were many other, and I don't think we have time right now, at least, but to go through all of it. But there were a whole range of different measures that were adopted throughout the year last year. So we had a very, very busy year, and the member states and the people in the member states who had to deal with this, the European Parliament as well, also had a very, very busy period. But as a result of all this, we did not face what we had sort of seen as a real risk, supply disruptions. That did not happen. Everybody was able to heat their homes and keep the lights on throughout last winter. Of course, now the key question is, for the coming winter, are there similar concerns? And we think that we are much better prepared this year. First of all, the gas storages are full. We need to keep up our efforts to save energy, but we also saw last year that a lot of additional renewables, especially wind and solar, came on stream. And for the first time last year, wind and solar actually produced more electricity than gas. So I think that is also, a very important element. Overall, I think it's a very important message here to say that the crisis that we faced last year, the main solution, the main way to deal with this crisis is really to accelerate the energy transition. More energy efficiency, more renewables as fast as possible. Voila. Can we see the next slide? Yeah, so as I said, as a result of Repower EU, we also looked at, can we be even more ambitious when it comes to renewable energy and energy efficiency? And we thought we could. We had, in the Fit for 55 proposals that I showed you earlier, we had proposed an overall share of renewable energy in the EU of 40%. And as a result of the need to phase out Russian fossil fuels, we thought that we need to go higher, we need to go to 45. At the end of the negotiations with the Council and the Parliament actually supported the Commission of the 45%, but the Council, so the energy ministers representing the member states, didn't quite want to go that high. And as a result of all of that, we ended up with 42.5%, which is still hugely ambitious. If you consider today we have something like 22, it is practically a doubling in 7 years. And this is really ambitious. We need also to, of course, be aware that a lot of the low-hanging fruits are already eaten. And to get all these renewables, you have to, for example, do more offshore, which is a little bit more complicated, although also there, the costs for offshore wind are coming down very dramatically. But still, it is a hugely ambitious target. I think we all recognize that. On energy efficiency, we had proposed 9%. This is a new way of calculating this with a base year of 2020 rather than 2007 that we had before. We thought we could go to 13%, and as you see, we ended up with 11.7%. That directive is adopted, the Renewable Energy Directive. We hope will be adopted in 2 weeks' time. All the political agreements are there. It just needs to be formally confirmed. Of course, all of this will require enormous investments. That's why we are also making a lot of money available, for example, in this RRF. So this is essentially all the money that was found to deal with the economic crisis following COVID. So we have about 300 billion euros in funding for these types of things through the RRF. For example, renovating buildings, but also many other things that will speed up the energy transition. And then equally important, and that's the little red dot there, or the big red dot, all of this, of course, has to be supported by a strong policy framework. You cannot imagine to have all these investments taking place unless there is a type of legal certainty for those who have to make the investments. And this is, of course, all the legislation in the Fit for 55 package. And we think also with the package that has been considerably strengthened. And I think that the last couple of slides are just going through, and I think I'll do that very quickly because otherwise I'm speaking into the time that we should normally have to discuss. But if we look at the last couple of slides, then that's some of the key directives there. I already talked about the Energy Efficiency Directive. The Renewable Energy Directive with a target of 42.5%. One thing that's very important, and that is now in this directive, that is streamlining the permitting and authorization rules, because everybody you talk to in the renewable energy sector, they say, The main bottleneck is that it takes too long to get the necessary permissions to deploy the energy to go forward with these projects. And that's why already in the so-called emergency regulations that we came forward with last year, we had very significant simplification of these rules, shortening of the time limits that member states and other authorities need to deliver to deal with this. Super important and very good to have this now in the directive itself, because the emergency regulations, by definition, is temporary. It is not permanent legislation. It is something that lasts essentially for 1 year unless it is prolonged. It might have to be a little bit prolonged because, as I said, this is a directive. It has to be put into national legislation, and before that happens, it could be some time. So these things that were adopted last year are directly binding because they are not directives but regulations. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is very important because 40% of our energy is used in buildings. We need really to speed up the rate of renovation for these buildings. Very important to note that in this directive, we now have for the first time energy performance requirements for buildings. So basically saying that certain types of buildings have to be renovated up to a certain standard by a certain time. Now, this is still being negotiated, and I'll be honest with you and say that, you know, it is not something that everybody is too keen on. The European Parliament supports it very much, but some member states fear that this could be very costly because, of course, there are lots of public buildings involved here, and to say that you need to have an energy performance certificate which moves up the scale by a certain date will obviously be expensive and could lead to difficulties. So we'll see where that ends. But this, for us, was a very important step to have these energy performance requirements for buildings put into legislation. And the last slide, I think, apart from the conclusions, is that, of course, we also have eco-design and labeling. So basically, eco-design setting rules for the energy efficiency of the energy consuming products that we sell in the EU, appliances, but also boilers and fans, and we're looking now also at heat pumps and things like that. Very important. Labeling, allowing the consumers to know when they buy something, is it energy efficient or not? And that, of course, has to be constantly updated as technology develops. We know a lot of the progress will have to come through digitalization. So we did an action plan on digitalization of the energy system, an area which we have not worked with previously. We work now very closely with our colleagues in DG Connect, so the department in the Commission that looks at IT issues. Data sharing will be really important for this to happen. And then, of course, we also need to be aware that there are very important industrial aspects about all this. We want a lot of the technologies that are needed for the energy transition to be produced in Europe, and that's why we came with this whole package related to net zero industry, in particular the Net Zero Industry Act, but also a piece of legislation looking at critical raw materials to avoid new areas of over dependence on imports. So that's something that is also being negotiated right now. So let me, I think there's still a couple of minutes, for at least 1 minute for the conclusions. So you will see them on the screen here. I mean, they're not, I think, very surprising to you. So obviously energy is really a very strategic sector geopolitically, and the war in Ukraine has highlighted that. But also we know that 75% of our emissions are directly related to energy. So if we need to eliminate all emissions, the energy sector has to change very dramatically. As I said, the key response is really to accelerate the energy transition, more renewables, more energy efficiency. A system approach is important, and I haven't talked about that, but we also have a strategy for that came out in 2020. And of course, we need to be active on all levels, regional, local and regional level, member state level. Industry itself has a key role to play, but I think also without some pushing from the EU at the EU level, it will not work. So we think, and of course I have to say that we think that EU has a very important role to play. And as I said, we also see progress. We saw a lot of progress last year. It was a very special year because of all the turbulence in the energy markets, but also progress on actually moving forward, for example, on renewables and on energy efficiency. Less perhaps on energy efficiency than renewables, but still. But we still think that there's a huge scope for even more. And but of course, I mean, there's a limit to how much you can do and how much can be absorbed, both in terms of getting the decisions made, but of course they also have to be implemented, and that's something that is also on our mind. But I mean, we're not done for sure. And I mean, if you look at, for example, the heating sector, which I know is something that you're looking at specifically in this forum. The heating sector has a huge job ahead of it to really move away from fossil fuels and reduce emissions. I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope it wasn't too long. And of course, I look forward to any kind of questions or comments that you may have. Here you see all the different things. I think we will share the presentation afterwards, so you can look at that in peace and quiet, and go and check some of these things where you can find a wealth of information. Thank you.
Super. Hans, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And yeah, with pleasure, we will share, of course, all the presentations after the event with the participants, at least there. So yeah, any questions from the floor already? So I would maybe have a question from my side. I would be a little bit interested, of course, you already touched on it, the situation for this winter, the problem with Russia, and the question would be, so in your opinion, or how do you think, how secure the energy supplies in this coming winter, 23-24 will be? Will this be kind of the same situation as last winter, or do you see any significant changes there? Wait, we need to unmute you. What is this?
Unmute myself. Yes, there you are.
You muted yourself.
Yes. No, as I said, I think we are clearly better prepared for this winter. As I said, we already have diversified quite a lot away from Russian gas, in particular, with a lot of gas coming in from the US, for example. More than doubled the imports from US LNG. Our gas storages are full. There was a requirement for them to be full by the 1st of November. They were full well ahead of that. Not 100% full, but 90% full, which is already a lot better than last year. From that perspective, I think we are definitely better prepared. But there are also signs that the market is still what we call volatile. It doesn't take a lot to see little disruptions. I don't know if you noticed, but over the summer, there were, it didn't even, I think in the end it happened, but even when the rumors happened that there would be strikes in Australia in some of their LNG production facilities there, like in a day or so, the gas price, the international gas price, increased by 18%, just on the rumor of a strike in okay, an important facility, but you know, LNG is available in many different places, and we are not in the EU overly dependent on Australian gas. But so I think all of this shows that, you know, there are volatilities in the market, and we don't know what could happen. But in terms of, shall we say, physical disruptions, so basically blackouts and, you know, the gas drying out, we think we are much better prepared. We've also, to deal with all eventualities, we have sort of beefed up our solidarity arrangements between the member states. So it would be unlikely that, you know, all member states would be suffering shortages. So if one or two member states find themselves in an unlikely situation of a shortage, there are then rules in place that there will be sort of sharing arrangements. And we have identified the customers that you cannot cut off, which are, you know, essentially households. So people cannot live without gas because it's essential for their life. Certain types of other things like hospitals and things like that. So, but there are other things that can be interrupted in the event of a situation. Now, we don't think it would happen, but I mean, we don't know. So we think we are considerably better prepared. But of course, nobody is going to say that there is no risk. I mean, there is always a risk, and we are in a situation where there are sort of important changes happening in the energy markets. Then some people say, but the fact that you are now relying more on renewables, does that create higher risks? And of course, it is possible you can have periods with very little wind and very little sun. But we think the backup is there in terms of the other types of electricity generation, essentially, that can step in, that can be ramped up in those situations. And the fact that our gas storages are full, up to 90 days, I think it's quite significant.
Yeah. This is probably also for Russia a pretty double-edged sword to use this to use gas on a really longer basis, as a pressure instrument.
It is. I mean, we've seen that. We have in some of our documents, and I saw also in the State of the Union speech by our president last week, she was using the word the weaponization of energy, which is in fact what is happening. Essentially, I think we have now to understand that Russia is unpredictable and unreliable supplier of energy. And this was, I think, a surprise, at least to some, because I think we had been seeing that, you know, all during the Cold War, Russia had always honored all their obligations in terms of deliveries of energy to the EU. But of course, it happened, and we now are in a completely new situation, and we need to take the starting point from there and find ways of, you know, dealing with our energy and also dealing with our energy transition without any imports from Russia.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any questions from the floor? So you can either unmute yourself or raise your hand or write in the chat there. Don't forget. So I would have another question, a little bit the position of the EU on e-fuels, and maybe also your prediction there, how this gonna look like in the future. Is there maybe like a specific focus now on battery-driven cars, and maybe hydrogen takes the second step, or do you see kind of a mix? And that would be interesting for me.
Yeah, I think it's there are. I mean, the electric vehicles, passenger cars, are coming. I mean, this is quite clear. If there is a clear winner, if we can put it like that, in terms of passenger cars, it's electric vehicles. And of course, the important thing is that we make sure that this is a good transition, that people can charge their cars. By the way, also the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is also dealing with that, because if you live in an apartment block, there should also be ways of you to charge your vehicle there. It's not only people who have their own house who can install their own, but also if you are in a rented apartment somewhere, you should be able to charge your car. So I think that is happening, and with AFIR we have rules for the infrastructure that is necessary. In terms of hydrogen, you have seen that with Repower EU we have important ambitions for hydrogen, which is 10 million tons produced in the EU and 10 million tons imported. And this is very importantly renewable hydrogen, so hydrogen produced from renewable sources of energy. And that's I think that is also in fact rather ambitious, but even with that, we need to make sure that that hydrogen goes to where it is most needed. And that, in our view, is in the so-called hard-to-abate sectors, so sectors that cannot be electrified, essentially certain types of industry, but also certain types of transport. I was yesterday speaking at the European Shipping Summit, and it's quite clear that shipping, which is of course very important, both in terms of bringing the goods to Europe, including energy, but also very important in terms of the energy that they use and the emissions that come from shipping, which is about 3% of overall emissions. But they are very keen on using different types of these new fuels, like ammonia, methanol, biomethanol, and they are coming. And we have in the Renewable Energy Directive, we have also specific focus on that, because of course there, as in many of these things, you have a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. I mean, nobody will build ships that are powered by engines running on ammonia unless you are sure that you can actually get the ammonia, that there is sufficient production of ammonia in the world that this is going to happen. So we are trying to create incentives in the Renewable Energy Directive for such production to take place, and that will be, I think, very, very, very important. So, yeah, a lot will be electrified. Both, I mean, as I said, passenger cars, also heating, by the way, with heat pumps. There was a big step towards electrification. We will see a very important increase in the demand for electricity, but also there will be demand for these new fuels, both biofuels that should then be. Oh, did I lose you? No, you just disappeared on my screen. Can you still hear me?
No, yeah, no problem.
Okay, very good. Just my screen went funny. But also biofuels, and there, of course, the policy is very clear. We are looking for advanced biofuels. We are not looking on sort of food crop-based biofuels. The role of these should be really very limited, but there is biofuels produced from waste, from agriculture, forestry, also municipal waste, and so on and so forth. That will be important. That there's a specific target now for these type of fuels in the Renewable Energy Directive. I think it's 5.5%. So that's by 2030, and that's actually quite a steep increase from what we see today. So in the transport in particular, this will be important.
Yeah, super. Thank you very much. We got a few questions from the audience. If you want, you can also say them yourself. Maybe Nihat, Nadebola, and Cornelia. If not, I can. Yeah, Cornelia is.
Hello.
Or yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Hello.
Who wants to go first? Cornelia, and then
the floor,
yeah.
if I may.
Ladies first.
Ladies first. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Well, I will be part of the panel later on, so I just say my name. It's Cornelia Vaquette. I'm from the Austrian Association for Building Materials and Ceramic Industries. I represent some very energy and CO2 intensive sectors. And of course, we're struggling with energy supply, security of supply, prices, and so on. It's really has been a difficult year last year. And I was wondering, I mean, the plans from the commissions are very good and very big. I mean, of course, I have some criticism to tell you, but I won't do that now. I would just like to know, we face more and more that society, that people outside in the street, they don't want what we need. We need renewable energy, we need hydrogen, we need biogas, whatever, wind power, whatever. But they don't want to have these technologies in their backyard. And it's getting more and more difficult to have these projects committed. And yeah, I was wondering if there is a plan from the Commission to inform people better about what is needed to have the energy transition.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And, you know, it is, it's not a new thing. It has happened, but of course, as renewable energy becomes more and more important, as the installations become bigger and bigger, we also see these concerns. So, I mean, one thing that we have been really stressing is that we need to identify the right places for these things to be constructed. And we've asked the member states, they were initially called go-to areas, so areas where, you know, you could construct big renewable projects. They are now called something else, I think, renewable acceleration areas or something like that in the new directive. And I think that will help us. But we will never, of course, have a situation where everybody will be very, very happy to have their view sort of changed by an installation of a solar park or these type of things. So I think what is really important to understand is that if we want to fight climate change, if we want to secure that we can still actually have a life which is quite similar to the life we have today without huge temperature increases, we cannot continue to burn fossil fuels. If we don't want to burn fossil fuels, we need to have other solutions. Now we're in Austria today, so nuclear is not really an option, certainly in your country. For some countries it is, and that's fine, but it's also not something that is liked by everybody. So renewables is really the response. We need to find ways of constructing the renewables in the best possible way. Offshore, I think, is a huge opportunity because you can construct these things where there is space. We also now have floating solar that can be built offshore, because of course there are always land use issues related to the construction of renewables. And then we need to explain people, you know, this is what we need. The good thing is if you look at sort of we do these surveys, it's called Eurobarometer, and you ask people, you know, what are your views on these things? There is still a very strong support for renewables, and there's a very, very strong tendency to say that the most pressing issue and problem to deal with for Europe is climate change. And there are an increasing number of people who make the connection between that. I mean, as I said, you know, 75% of our emissions come from fossil fuel burning in the energy sector. So if you tell people these facts, they will understand. But you are right, it will be difficult, and we have other ideas. I mean, for example, the idea of energy communities where people actually go together and jointly own these things and run these things is actually something that has worked very well in some countries, because people then feel that, you know, they're part of it, and, you know, they see the wind turbines from their windows, but they say, but these are actually, you know, they are also mine, they produce for me, and that makes it easier. Something on the solar front that's really important is rooftop, because of course that is something that does not really bother you too much in terms of intrusion of views and so on. There are ideas and proposals in the Buildings Directive to have requirements for the installation of solar panels on all new buildings from a certain date and so on, and that's also being negotiated right now. And that's probably the way forward, because you know, that's a perfect place for solar panels. It's a better place than to have an enormous field full of panels. But if every house is every supermarket, every factory, every warehouse had solar panels, it would already be a huge step forward. So rooftop is, I think, part of the solution there.
Super. Thank you. Nihat, you want to go next, and then maybe Adebola, and we also have Roberto.
Thank you very much.
First, Nihat. Thanks.
I would like to ask regarding this. We heard that last year the 55% of energy in EU was from the renewable sources. It means solar and wind. But remaining 45% is from the gas power plant or nuclear power plant or other source. In same time, these other sources are the stabilizer of the energy system. In the future plans, is there a clear picture or plans? What would be what will give the stable system of electricity in the EU? We know that solar is not stable, wind power plants is not stable source. Something must be the stabilizer of all the system.
That was a very good point. And so by 2050, our projections show, I mean, since there will be hardly or probably even zero fossil fuels in electricity production, so we would expect something like 70% renewables and maybe around 30% nuclear. The nuclear, we don't know. I mean, you know, always an uncertainty. Some of the new nuclear projects take much longer to build and plan, but I think it will be around that. So 70% renewables. A lot of this will be what we call variable renewables, solar and wind. Some of it will also be hydro, which of course you can control, especially if you have ability to use pumped hydro, so you can pump the water back into the reservoir when there is little demand for electricity from the grid and so on and so forth. But you are right, there will be a need for stabilization. So we think this will come from different things. It will come from better interconnections, because it's unlikely that you will have a situation where there is no sun, no wind in all of Europe. I mean, you know, you would need to have connections going so that you can actually transport the electricity from where it can be produced because the wind is blowing or the sun is shining to where it is needed. Even if, you know, where it is needed, they normally get their electricity from somewhere else. So interconnections, strengthening of the grid, the trans-European electricity networks will be very important. Secondly, storage. We need to clearly work out the need for storage of electricity, and of course, you know, storage of electricity is a complicated thing because it's quite expensive. Normally, the best thing is to consume the electricity the moment it is produced, but there are ways of storing it. There are thermal storages. You can also use the production of hydrogen to, so I would say, make the balancing so that when you have surplus, when you have more production of electricity than you actually need, you run your electrolyzers at maximum power, and then when there is a high demand for electricity in the grid, or maybe if there are days with very little wind, maybe the electrolyzer is running less. Then you produce your electrofuels, and you can use that also in a way to balance out the supply and demand for electricity. But it will be new things that we need to learn. We probably also have to accept that we need to use electricity differently. I mentioned digitalization, and I think that will have an important role to play. We just have to accept that, it will not be possible, or it's certainly not a good idea, to charge your car exactly when you want. If you have the possibility of charging it at night when there is limited demand for electricity, or if you can charge it when there is extra electricity in the grid, because maybe it's a very sunny day or the wind is blowing very strongly, you should do that. Same thing with running your washing machine, your dishwasher, all these things. You should not do that during the peak hours. And if you are probably familiar with the curves showing the demand for electricity, and you will see it fluctuates a lot during the day. And the difficulties are always, around the end of the afternoon, when everybody comes home from work, all the kids switch on their PlayStations or whatever it's called nowadays. You're cooking, TV is going, all these type of things, and that is really the peak hour of the day, and that's not the moment where you should then maybe also switch on your washing machine or whatever. So, and a lot of that can be dealt with if you have the right ways of controlling these different energy and electricity consuming appliances. So that's something that will have to be looked at with this digitalization process more generally. It will simply be different, because in the old days there was always you could just turn up your coal-fired power station if the demand was more, or turn it down. You can't do that with renewables. There isn't a switch. There isn't a handle you can turn up and down. I mean, it's produced according to the conditions, and that's how it is. But it is manageable. All studies show that it is manageable, and we know also from the different experiences in the member states. Some member states already today have a very, very high share of renewables. I am Danish. We have, way over 50% wind, and it can be managed because we are well interconnected to other countries. So on days where there is little wind, we get electricity maybe from the hydro productions in Sweden or in Norway. And it is managed. It just is a different way of managing and balancing the electricity system.
Yeah, thank you very much. Roberto, do you want to go next, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good morning. I think this problem is being already asked by some other people before, but as we know, maybe I'm redundant. The renewable energy is not constant during the day, whilst the society today need energy also during winter time and during the night. So therefore, I don't know if it's been done a calculation of how many square meter of panels we would need to cover all the energy needs in EU, and also taking in account that if we want to change our mobility system from fossil fuels to electricity, we will need even more energy. Has someone calculated how much more energy we will need to have all our cars for all our electrical mobility, how many square meters of panel we will need, and how we will keep the supply during the night, because we may think, okay, we can store the energy, but how many batteries we will need? And another things that is not been mentioned, in order to create all this facility, for example, the batteries will come from countries outside Europe, and to produce battery, we need energy, and those countries outside Europe will burn fossil fuels to produce the energy. And at the end of the cycle, how much is the energy, fossil energy burned for make the infrastructure, and how much of energy have we received back from the soil? So in order to make a proper calculation of the CO2 balance, how do you call zero balance emission, something like that? Because we create all this infrastructure where we burn fossil fuel, and of course we make pollution, we produce CO2, and then we receive back in the future free energy. But how is the balance at the end of this process? Okay, that's all. Thank you.
All valid points. I think very good points. I'm not a researcher, and but I know that, of course, you know, there are people who are looking at all of this and are probably able to respond much better than I am. I mean, what we do know is that it is feasible. We know also from the Commission's own research institution, especially in the joint research centers that we are operating both in Italy and in Holland, that, you know, it is feasible, these things. But of course, many of the points are valid. I think for the balancing and the making sure that there's always the energy that you need is always available. I think, you know, as I said earlier, I think there are essentially three elements. There's storage, additional storage requirements, and we need to incentivize investments in storage. We need to identify also what are the best ways of storage, and I've seen some calculations about the cost of different types of storage, showing that battery storage is a lot more expensive than, for example, thermal storage, where you can store, for example, hot water in thermal ways. The second thing we need is our interconnections, so that we can transport the energy in Europe to where it is needed. And then we need to look at demand management. Not just we need to be more energy efficient. We need to do that, but we also need to look at using the energy when it is available, and not necessarily when it is what we've always done. We will just continue to do it like that. No, we maybe need to look at it differently. And then I think the other way, the other issue you mentioned is that, you know, does it make sense? I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you said is we're doing all these things in Europe. We're also investing heavily, and all of these things, of course, come with a cost. But what happens if nobody else does it in the world? Does it really make sense? And that is true. I mean, the EU's share of global greenhouse gas emissions are something like, you know, certainly less than 10%, maybe even quite some points below 10%. So obviously, in the big effort to reduce global climate change, and this is a global problem, it only makes sense if what we are doing here is done elsewhere. We need to show the example. We need really to say, look, this can be done. It can even be done while we are preserving our welfare and our prosperity. It has created massively new businesses, as it already has, and it will continue to do. But I mean, obviously, we don't want certain types of businesses in Europe to be out-competed by producers in third countries that have much lower standards and who are maybe powering their production with very dirty, cheap coal. This is quite clear. And that's why this thing that I mentioned, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is really important, because that is in a way to protect exactly European industry against that type of thing, because that means that when such products arrive in Europe, they have to demonstrate how they have been produced, and if they have been produced in a way which has a lot of carbon emissions or CO2 emissions associated with them, there will be a tax that will mean that these products will become more expensive than they otherwise would be. And that's, I think, very, very important.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I will need to leave you very soon. I have to warn you. I think we're also running into the other session.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe one last short question. So maybe 2 minutes answer of Adebola. I will maybe just pose the question. It's just I think about standardization or standards. Basically the standards that the EU sets for renewable energy, how does that impact the standards that the member states create? Is there a lot of local variances? And I think Adebola has a little bit the impression that standards are fragmented. I mean, I see this maybe also in Austria, that in Carinthia you don't have any wind turbines at all because of local political leadership. In other Carinthian states you have, so Austrian states. So maybe a short view on that, really short. Yeah.
Really shortly, I think obviously, the way in which any member state wants to deal with covering its energy needs is for that member state. There are certain minimum standards. We would like there to be a share of renewables in it. But at the end of the day, the energy mix is a member state responsibility. Also, what types of renewables? So, for example, in Austria, you have a lot of hydro. You are very lucky in that sense. So that, of course, covers a lot. In other countries that are flat, like here in Belgium, I mean, there is no hydro, so there you need to go the other way. You need to look at other, obviously. And this is all for the member states to decide, what is the right mix. Also, the whole issue about nuclear, you want nuclear, you don't want, none of the EU's business. So it is not standardized as such. We have standards for certain types of renewables, especially in the bio area, to make sure that we use bioenergy in a sustainable way. We don't want, for example, biomass to arrive in the EU produced cutting down enormous areas of forest or rainforest or things like that. So there are standards, but otherwise the standardization is a different process. I mean, it's not really something that we don't have standards as such. I mean, there's a freedom from member states to use the renewables that they want. And also it's important to see that, the targets that we have in the Renewable Energy Directive are EU targets. They're not. It doesn't mean that every member state needs to meet these targets. And clearly some member states, are already way above these targets, and they still need to do more. They also still have efforts to make. And then there are some, where there is maybe very little space and the conditions are not very good. And maybe they have to do a little bit less, but overall the EU should reach the share of 42.5%. And that is what we will be checking. We have then an indicative formula. Now it becomes a little bit technical. We have an indicative formula in the directive whereby we can sort of check whether we think that every member state has done its fair share. And of course, if it hasn't done its fair share, we will have a discussion, and we have that normally in the framework of the discussions about national energy and climate plans, which are plans that member states have to submit to the EU, and there they have to sort of give us, you know, what is happening, what are you planning to make happen. And if we think that they are not sufficiently ambitious in renewables, we will have that discussion with them.
Okay, super.
Yeah.
Hans, thank you very much for the presentation and the Q&A. It was really nice having you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of the seminar. I will unfortunately not be able to join you later on, but I'm sure you will have a good discussion.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.